I'm speaking first. Nikolai speaking second. No preferences.
All right, closing up.
Dominic speaking first, Samuel speaking second. Here they is fine for both.
All right, closing up.
Shreyas is speaking first. Here they is fine.
And Preston is speaking second. Here they is also fine.
Cool. My name is Stefan. Judging with me will be Karen and Ashutosh. Same rules apply as always. 7-minute speeches. There'll be a sound signal after minute 1, a sound signal after minute 6, double time signal after minute 7. After 7:15 or so, there'll be continuous banging on the table, and I will stop listening. Yeah, I strongly encourage you to keep time in case you don't hear time signals. But other than that, no further rules. With that in mind, I invite the Prime Minister to open the round for opening government. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
By the way, POI through chat, no specific gender pronoun. I probably take the POI minute 5 or just before 6. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Principle of democracy requires the free flow of information between individuals and political actors to allow the constituents to build their own preference based on the available information that surrounds them. So just set up one piece of framing as to why we are the one that actually put the best mechanization into this debate. Notice that what the wording in this motion is, we still have in opening government mechanism like social media companies doing some limited censorship. For example, censoring some tweets that are proven to be inflicting some violence or labeling some contents to be not having credible basis of that information to be distributed, or suspending some accounts if it is proven to do some defamation. But it needs to be based on the people that are within that social media to try to do check and balance, to try to report by themselves. The one that exists in the opening opposition, what they need to defend is based on the wording of this motion is on the idea of independently deplatforming some politician. It means that there is an element of arbitrariness there. Like often the social media companies have an interest to not take into account some context or some specific nuance within the accounts or the tweets. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily need to be based on the people try to report something and they need to ban it. Sometimes it's just there is an arbitrary nature of the social media company to try to ban something just to play safe or to pander to their shareholders or try to like cancel some account just because it is what people think they need. So that's the differentiation between opening government and the opposition batch. So I'm going to forward you 2 arguments. First, on the idea of principle justification, why this is having a lot of element of disproportionality within the way that social media companies independently banning some like politicians' social media account. Number 2, I'm going to talk about the harms of further polarization and the emergence of right-wing or extreme fringe social media companies that will emerge in the side of opening opposition and closing opposition. So first, on the idea of principle. So why there is element of this proportionality in the way that independent measure of social media companies try to ban politicians' account? There are 3 reasons for this. Number 1, a lot of the times that the political ideology that is disseminated through tweets or social media contents are the crystallization of people's voice and people's aspiration in the democratic context. Although it is not 100% accurate to the way that the content is being framed within some particular tweet, but there is element of representation of people's voices there. For example, when Donald Trump tried to tweet like Democrats try to take the local jobs and giving it to migrants, Maybe it's not 100% correct, but there is element of legitimacy there that a lot of people in the Rust Belt in the US right now have lost their job due to a lot of neoliberal policies being made by Democratic Party. And sometimes these kind of like catchy tweets done by Donald Trump is more relatable to the people on the ground. There is element of representation there. If you silence this, it means that you silence credible, legitimate people's voice and people's aspiration in democratic context, principally unjust. But number two, for all of the harms that are prescribed into this particular tweet, probably the opposition wants to use the example of capital violence. I think that the blame and the fault should not be attributed entirely to that social media account of politicians, because when capital violence occurred, aside of social media account, there are elements of sentimentality of people that want to be patriotic by like going to Capitol and try to rally there. There is partisan hatred. There is people's passion running high, leading to election cycle. So there is other element that you need to be taken into account, not entirely the social media account, because you will just create mismatch solution when you try to ban this. People think that the problem is already finished, despite there is no attempt to try to reconcile Democrats and Republican. There is no attempt to actually tone down this hatred and sentimentality of people on the ground. But number three, there's still a lot of mechanism to try to do check and balance to this particular tweet. There are a lot of social media discussion whether or not this tweet is true. There are a lot of people that try to make counter tweets and counter threats to say that this is not a legitimate tweet. There is discussion that will make people able to pick for themselves what is the best for them. So we still can ban and try to suspend some tweets that are indeed people reported to be having some severe objective impacts, but we shouldn't ban the account. That's just really unproportional. I'm going to take closing opposition if they have any.
Yeah, just clarification. If I wanted to deplatform somebody on your side, what process do I have to go through?
I mean, there will be some thresholds that some sizable amount of people that have social media accounts in that particular social media like companies need to send and try to explain the reasoning as to why this account needs to be banned, needs to be censored, needs to be suspended. What you need to define is the social media companies independently trying to deplatform these individuals. So now, argument number two, the harms of more polarization in the internal politics of the countries. So we need to understand that like the social media right now has been diversified. It's not only about the Facebook, Twitter, that is already trying to become center left and trying to be using cancel culture and become more progressive. You have the emergence of right-wing social media account like Parler, Wimi, Gap, and there are mainstream media accounts that try to be more right-wing right now. For example, Newsmax and OAN. So what happens then is on their side of the house, the people and the followers of these politicians that are banned from Twitter and Facebook, they will rally and diversify their capital towards these particular far-right social media companies. What is so dangerous of this? It means that there will be less check and balance. People don't know what they are going to do. People don't actually understand what are they going to do next. And there is not going to be any discussion either what they are doing is good or wrong. For example, right now, when there is plan to do capital attack, people still try to moderate themselves because there is incentive to try to pander towards the center left or the progressive moderate individuals if the far right bots try to persuade them to go to capital riots. But on their side of the house, because there is this far right galvanization within this one echo chamber of political discussion, there is no interest to try to moderate themselves. A lot of like bad jargons, a lot of justification to murder other politicians are going to be rampant because there is no check and balance. In our side of the house, the echo chamber will be diminished because like Facebook and Twitter have interest to increase engagement. So there is cross ideological discussion that will do check and balance. Less harm exists in our side of the house.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. I invite the leader of the opposition to open the case for their side of the house. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
You are.
Thank you. PYs in the chat. We'll take on 520. We'll take one from closing government. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. Three things in the speech. Firstly, framing that explains to you that this happens rarely and it happens in selective and strategic moment that deals a lot with government's case. Secondly, the harms that will happen if social media companies do not have the option to do this and the deterrent benefits that we get from them being able to do this. Thirdly, the principal argument in this debate. Let's just jump into the framing because this deals with a lot of things that opening argument does. Basically, I think that to a large extent, this is likely to be done selectively and strategically. There are 5 structural reasons for why this is the case. Firstly, notice that these companies are profit-driven, meaning that they have the need to earn money and basically pay their dividends to shareholders, this type of things. Notice that this means that they have incentive to create a bipartisan pool of people because all people use this type of social media, meaning that they're not likely to basically pick and choose who to attack and do these particular things, and are likely to not want to do this because they fear other people opting out of their social media because their politician told them to. Secondly, they fear backlash from the state from being seen as if they're using this particular thing. They fear countervailing narratives, like, for example, you're censoring people and you're taking actions towards your own hands. And basically, because they fear this particular narrative existing in the political sphere, like let's say in the United States Senates, both Democrats and Republicans stating, okay, they're censoring us, we should deal with big tech. They fear asymmetrical power being pushed upon them. What is this asymmetrical power? It could be things like, for example, breaking up or nationalizing their companies, something that Elizabeth Warren really, really wanted. It may be things like over-regulating them, not allowing them to invest in these particular things, or creating specific laws. Notice that the state is the only practical actor who can do this to these companies. So because they don't want to get this narrative on them, they won't use this that many times. Thirdly, notice that, for example, and this is not trivial at all, you have a lot of resources as like social media company, right? So for example, you can do like things like create whole departments, understand data, look at the process, and understand when, for example, something has tipped the line and doesn't. This is, for example, why Donald Trump is practically the only politician who got deplatformed, and only because he created the riots in this particular thing. Fifthly, notice that notice their competition between different social media platforms. So there are in between each other. So just because they basically don't want to do something in particular, and then the other social media company being able to capitalize on the opportunity, they kick someone out. They most likely will do this only for the worst people. So it could be because it's a collective action problem that can be broken only for the worst people. Okay, what does this prove to you? It proves to you, firstly, not many politicians will be taken out. Secondly, on the balance of probabilities, the worst politicians will be taken out. But what is this implication? Firstly, it deals with a lot of things of the principle of censorship, right? Because we're not censoring that many people. But I would note, and this is direct report towards their case, if they're okay with still censoring politicians, still putting like those flags under when this is fake news or not confirmed information, then how necessarily does their principle still hold water? This is something that they may need to clarify. But also, just one point of rebuttal against the right-wing companies point. Like, notice something important. If they concede that you can also symmetrically in the debate still deplatform it, you're just not doing it independently, then why, for example, wouldn't you get the platform on their side of the house as well if they concede this? I think closing government need to have a more firmer, stronger stance in this debate for this to work. Okay, let's move on then to the first argument in this debate. Why basically we take away harms. Notice there are 3 specific harms that may happen from basically the worst politicians. The first thing is like direct physical harm, right? Like, for example, instigating capital riots with basically your slogans, your persuasion, the same way that Donald Trump did in these particular things. The second thing is also hate speech, right? Directly opposing, saying negative stereotypes associated with people, calling them out, being problematic about this. But also thirdly, fake news, right? Like Donald Trump literally stood up and said, like, drink the thing that you use to wash your hands, it will cure COVID, and this type of information in times of crisis. Like, this is very scandalous stuff that people basically, can get physically harmed to if the wrong people do these particular things. How does this change on our side of the house? And I want to be clear here. We create a deterrent where the social media platform can at any particular moment take you away. And note how does this fit in with our frame of this will be done selectively and strategically. You only have to do it once, right? You only have to do it one particular time to sell to the people, to signal to the people that this is an immense harm that can be done to them, for them to be fearful of you being able to do this particular thing, and for you to do this in this case. Why is this true? Notice how important social media campaigning and platforms are important for the politicians. This is first your capacity to be able to basically start up your campaign, to gather people who are on your forces. This is the modern way of communicating people, etc. But secondly, to rally up people, to come to protests, to gatherings, these type of things, etc. So and be able to capitalize reciprocally on this particular thing. So if you're able to take this away, this is, even if it's one time, even if it's Donald Trump, this image is ingrained in their decision-making calculus, and they will know not to say the scandalous things that they were talking about. They will know that if they basically do these sort of things, it's likely to make it on the better. We create on our side a better comparative where people aren't willing to say these scandalous things, aren't willing going to create harms towards these people, and you take away practically the worst of the politicians. Before I move on, closing government.
Okay, all the examples of harms you cite, like instigating riots and hate speech, are illegal under federal law and therefore would also be bannable under our side of the debate. You have to choose the cases where companies don't do it.
No. If it were illegal, then why it had to happen, and why did the social media had to do this to firstly respond to you in this particular way? Because Facebook was the one that deplatformed them. Secondly, I would note that in many cases, politicians actually do this signaling in a very mixed way. So it actually, because we're giving you structural reasons and incentives that corporations have the ability, the incentive and the ability to track them, to be able to take this particular thing. And you cannot get away with this soft prop, by the way. You have to stand more firmly. Second argument, principle. Notice that basically the human beings are the ones who created these corporations. I know the debaters really like to give a bad name towards corporations, etc. But these are the people who did this sort of things. Three things that they did. Firstly, they created the platform. Like, they took up the risk, they built up the initial investment, and they basically, it's an asset that was built for them in this particular thing. They basically trade off their time, their money, their effort, their lives basically in order to build this thing up. So it's basically an extension towards themselves. Secondly, they also have an obligation towards their current people who are using this sort of people. These are people who, for example, would, in their mind, would view the statements of Donald Trump as problematic or being against them in this particular thing. So they want to exercise this obligation by deplatforming. But you also have an incentive because you want to make money to build the system up, to contribute it, etc. Here are two analogies that I want you to think in your head. I have a car, and this car is my asset. Government cannot come to myself, put a gun to my head, and basically tell me you should drive this bastard that, for example, isn't someone that I want to drive in this particular thing, and I don't want this to be happen. This is analogously the same situation when they tell you you have to allow Donald Trump to continue to do this. But secondly, notice that it's, even if, here's the burden that we're taking. Even if government is right and they have practical benefit, which we don't, we prove to you that they don't. But even if they're right, look at the example. We could have nationalized all the companies like Pfizer, like biotech, like these sort of things, in order to create better vaccines. The reason we didn't do it is because we value these companies' capacity to exercise their rights and to basically do these sort of things. Why do we value them? Firstly, because we believe that you have an opt-out principle to say no to certain individuals. But secondly, that you don't have to be complicit in the crimes of the immoral actions of these particular things. You're not allowing this to happen on their side of the house. This is why it's principally unjust.
Cool. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, wait, I'm gonna set up my timer first. POI through chat, please. Yeah, with that said, okay. With that said, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is how I'm going to construct my speech. First, I'm going to put a framing. Why then? All of the harms that pose it by opening opposition is symmetrical at best on both sides of the house. But second, I'm going to point out what makes it asymmetrical then by enabling the social media companies to ban or not, right? So firstly, why then this is symmetrical? All of the harms that they pose it, like capital raiding, bashing minorities, demonizing minorities and whatnot, exists in both sides of the house. Because even if they manage to deplatform this politician from the social media discussion, the hatred and everything will still persist anyway in Twitter and Facebook. Because if you deplatform Trump, the followers are still there. The followers can still instigate all of the hatred, can still instigate all of the traumatic experiences and bash those minority. Hence, therefore, we said the harm is symmetrical. This framing is important because without even engaging to their likelihood, why then they would have the benefit to minimize the harm, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, there will be other stakeholders that will cause us the same exact harm from by this, like the politician did in and of itself. So at best, their best case scenario is marginal. That means their argumentation of like safe space for minority and whatnot would be questionable due to the fact that there are still other actors that their policy cannot cater to. They have to defend why then the platforming would literally save a lot of people on their side of the house. That's their burden, right? But second of all, what makes it asymmetrical then on our side of the house? We pose it two things. Number one, on the principle legitimacy. The only framing from opening opposition is to say that no, this will be accurate. This will not do. This will not be often. This is something that would be super accurate because the corporation is profit driven. They want the both audience to stay. two things on this. Firstly, notice it doesn't add any principal legitimacy to this particular thing, because those like specific moments when we do concede that this is not happening that often, it's actually the most subjective moments that exist, because most of the time this happens during elections. Most of the time this happens during crucial moments about policy making and decision making, right? Exactly this moment are overthought-based sentiments that are pushed from the opposition party like Democrats politician, AOC, Bernie Sanders, that constantly bashed Trump and whatnot in that moment. Exactly in this moment are the most delicate and the most sentimental moment where people cannot be objective to begin with. So sure, that framing is true, but it doesn't add, it doesn't debunk why then this is principally abhorrent to begin with, to the fact that the accuracy and whatnot is still arbitrary and subjective towards one single individual and one single opinion in that platform. But B, more on this, we said that exactly this type of movement, we said that we should value both opinions in and of itself principally, due to the fact that it doesn't only concerns about life of one people or one specific community, but rather the entire nation. Sure, we can see that their hate speech and fake news might be bad, but there are some other alternative and mitigation for them to be able to stay and stick within the platform to begin with. But moreover than that, we said that one-sided opinions cannot be valued as something that is absolute to begin with, due to the fact that there are some degree of legitimacy in other and opposing views, like what Prime Minister said. So in the midst of all of that framing, we said that what my Prime Minister said about principles legitimacy still stands anyway, and it's still abhorrent, even though the framing exists by opening opposition. So that means that in all cases, in all instances, we say we do not support an excessive act that is arbitrary and that is independent and whatnot. But in comparative, within this is more principally acceptable due to the fact that the platforming happens after a series of discussion, after a series of check and balances and whatnot. So that's to say, after a series of reports, after the series of fact checks and whatnot, and that person or that politician still just do the same thing, we said that that's exactly the only objective moment when you can deplatform politician and whatnot. Right, so that's what it means by banning independently, deplatforming politician or a side house. So therefore, in comparative, it's more principally legitimate. But second of all, on a practical level, they posit the idea of social media safe space and whatnot and those kind of things. The problem is, number one, that I don't think that this particular benefit is exclusive, due to the fact that if you're a minority and you feel uncomfortable in social media sphere, we admit that they have this cross ideological discussion, those kind of thing. We say that you could mute those stuff. You could hide your tweets. You don't want to see somebody's tweets and those kind of thing. So therefore, there are a lot of mitigating factors for you to feel safe and to be able to have social media for your own self, right? But what is harmful then on their side house? What is harmful is that you're going to instigate more hatred by the Trump supporters and whatnot, because the way that they disseminate information right now, assuming that it would stop doing this entirely on their side of the house, is that through right-wing social media, like MeWe, like Parler, those kind of right-wing social media, basically. That's to say that more likely they would have dissemination of information that are unfiltered, no check and balances. Therefore, the level of extremism and the level of radicalism would be far worse on that side of the house. So at best, sure, in opening opposition, you would protect this minority from social media hatred. But what is asymmetrical then is that the ability for these people to live peacefully in their real life to begin with. That's to say that when people are becoming more extremist, they would eventually do manifestation of hatred on the street. Exactly, gun shootings happen. Exactly, police brutality happens. Or exactly, people bashing and people raiding gay bars and whatnot. It happens on that side of the house because you limit the ability of the freedom of these people to eventually voice out in the mainstream social media. More on that, we said that Trumps and whatnot would have more incentive structure to use victim cards to see that this is a liberal media's way for liberal media's way to eventually shut our opinions out and those kind of things. This emotional rhetoric more likely will instigate more hatred and whatnot and sentiments that will exacerbate the situation that already exists in status quo. I'll take CO if they have something. 1, 2, 3. Okay, moving on. So therefore, what does it prove, right? This proves that even if, let's just say that they have the benefit of social media safe space or thought, it doesn't matter at all, because it is on the cost of people's life in real life to begin with. That's to say that on our side of the house, how then we minimize this particular harm? When we have cross-ideological, discussion and those kind of things, we have fact checks and whatnot. Sure, some extremist people would still do things on the street, but we're going to minimize the numbers. That's to say that those gray area, conservative and whatnot, might not necessarily receive this hatred and those kind of things. This is already a benefit due to the fact that protecting these people is not only in social media basis per se, but also comes from real life basis to begin with. Because it doesn't matter if they feel protected in social media while they cannot work, when they don't be accepted in work field, or they don't feel secure riding public transport, especially for people who are trapped to live in white neighborhoods, for instance, due to financial constraint, or people who live in swing states and those kind of things. These vulnerable individuals are far more exposed to harm on their side of the house, exactly because you're going to give them more reasons to hate these people. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the deputy leader of the opposition to continue the opposition case.
Okay, am I audible? Rumen, mute this, брат.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Three, two, one. Okay, firstly, on the hate speech symmetrical point, I think there's three responses here. I think firstly, volume matters in these kind of situations. Rumen gave you the mechanism in which politicians are able, to the biggest platform that there are, such as Twitter and Facebook, to actually go to people and spread their problematic messaging. So to the extent in which we compare where do we have more problematic messages and to where does it get to more people, obviously on their side of the house, it gets to more people in the case that you're not banned. Second of all, perception of legitimization. To the extent in which you're banned, people are more likely to ask the question, why are you banned? What happened that you're banned? What is problematic in this situation? This kind of feeds into our frame in terms of this happens only in specific situations. So it allows for people who follow these hateful people to actually go there, look at the information, and maybe change their opinion to whether maybe Trump crossed the line this time compared to his other rhetoric. And thirdly, this kind of clashes with our deterrent mechanism. And what we're trying to say here is that this also kind of amplifies over time, right? Because if you do it one time, you lose the incentive to do it multiple times rather than to do it only that particular times. But I also want to add in the line of shadow ban. What is a shadow ban? Currently, basically, due to the policies of Facebook, Twitter, etc., you're pretty much able to ban somebody without actually banning them. And I don't want to completely disregard the motion. What I'm going to say is that the shadow ban does mean that you get less access to those people. So to the extent in which for political or other reasons Facebook or Twitter has the incentive to ban you or to remove less and less people from watching you, they can still do that on both sides of the house. They can do that by not showing people what you post, by silencing you because you violated their terms of service, or for example, silencing the people that actually follow you for hateful speech or whatever. All of this means is that on the comparative, we don't like shadow bans and stuff like that because people can't actually see and hold accountable Facebook for banning somebody that you follow and represents your points of view much better on our side of the house. Second of all, on the moral principle, etc., etc. No actual comparison, like this is deputy speeches 101 of to why do we care about one principle over the other principle. Here's three analytical reasons as to why we care more about our principle than your principle. Reason number one, volume. More people are impacted on our side of the house. So we are not banning political parties or whole ideologies. We are banning only particular politicians. So to the extent in which people really value this idea, they're still going to follow it and they're still going to see people that actually represent that idea. Like Twitter can't stand up and say, oh, after tomorrow, all Republicans are banned, fuck it, let's go for liberalism, right? Like this is not central in the debate. And like this is pretty much on the comparison, like we don't ban alcohol because of alcoholics and things like that. But second of all, I think that like to the extent in which we lose our ability to have complete autonomy over what we produce and what is our direct extension of ourselves in terms of our labor, what we create as products and what we sell to people, there is no actual point in having the ability of free speech and being understanding, because the whole point of free speech is for you to be able to hold accountable the government from shitting you over. To the extent in which you can complain all of the time, but actually the government can still on a principle level come in and take your car away, or make you drive somebody that you don't want to drive, or even like this is our stance. It's okay for you to not sell a cake to an LGBT person if that is your stance. What I'm trying to say here is that we still believe that that is more important than you just having the speech, because then there's no point in having that principle right to the extent in which the government can still override it, and you can just complain about it with your free speech. And thirdly, on a level of opting out of this, we completely win this principle, right? Because to the extent in which these people, politicians and their ideas, can just opt out of this and say, okay, I'm not going to be a politician, I'm not going to run for parliament, I'm just going to push for that idea, that ideology, or that problematic, then Facebook can just outright ban them without receiving repercussions to the extent in which they're actually not violating their terms of service. And then we go into the shadow banning again. So I think that's problematic. Before I continue with the echo chamber bullshit, I'm going to take closing.
Do you think businesses should be allowed to refuse services only towards specific ethnic groups and, for example, exclude Black people from their businesses?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the echo chamber. Also, like, just one small thing, I really want to see you prove that politicians are pretty much disenfranchised minorities in our society. Go with that one, right? Like, this is gonna be a great debate for people to watch on stream. Now, moving on to the echo chamber thing, which is like basically this creates echo chamber. I have 3 points here. I think the first one is, if this is actually good, people are gonna do it anyway. So like, it doesn't really matter if Trump, he had his own show on Facebook where he pretty much put his own person in terms of like saying the news and what actually happened in the country. He's either going to do that on Facebook or on another platform. I think that comparatively, at least, there's less people on the second platform, because people are still incentivized to actually use Facebook because their friends are there, because there are other things that they follow are there. And I don't think that the average person is like, oh my gosh, I care so much about politics that I'm going to never use Facebook again. Good luck proving that one. But second of all, I think that Facebook in generally has an incentive to actually show you the things that you like. So on both sides of the house, you're far more likely to see things that are confided in your echo chamber. Like, this is the problem with American society and polarization in general. And thirdly, I think that even if echo chamber is worse on their side of the house, I think that like when you compare this to the, and this again feeds into the 5-point frame that we explained in this debate, if we compare this to actual moments where like hate speech is happening and like people are like trying to inhale, I don't know, like detergent or whatever, or they're actually trying to completely remove fair democratic elections, we still believe that that is more important than some people being a bit more radical or whatever. And on the comparative, again, on our side of the house, there are still ways that you can fight this in terms of echo chambers, such as educating people, such as calling people out on other platforms. Like Trump can still go on Fox News and say Facebook is the worst thing ever, don't go to Facebook or whatever. And thirdly, you can still regulate it to a certain extent, like what is trying to do right now. Maybe try regulating the shadow ban, I don't know. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you, guys.
Cool. I think the speaker of that speech, I invite the member for the government to extend the proposition case. Here.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 2 points from CG. First, we say independent deplatforming is being systematically overused in the status quo. Second, we say even if you don't believe us that, still the case that deplatforming itself is bad as it creates more backlash and even more echo chambers. Banning solves those 2 issues. Before I come to those 2 extensions, I want to quickly do some way into opening half. 2 remarks here, and then like one specifically dealing with each opening team. I think first of all, we have to note what also Samu says in his POI. illegal stuff is outside of this debate. That specifically goes against OO. So like explicit hate speech, explicit racism is a crime under the law. We can persecute that, not in the debate. But second of all, we also want to put all of that principled clash aside. We really aren't sure whether like the principle of freedom of expression for those politicians is to be weighted more than the principle of corporate freedom. I don't really care who wins this, probably our OG, but I think the debate is decided ultimately on practical grounds. The last remark is our extension 1, I think, specifically addresses the case of OO. Our extension 2 then I think trumps our OG, as we explain directly how that backlash comes to play and why people migrate to Parler and why that's bad. Okay, now let's first of all talk about systematic overuse. We hear a 5-point preempt by OO with regard to that. The first, they say, well, companies have an incentive to be quite neutral because they want to have a large customer base. The problem is that that neglects entirely that companies don't have the largest customer base possibly. They mostly have niches, right? So Twitter has quite a liberal audience, so they definitely want to play in favor of their liberal audience. So it's not that they like develop a product that the entire market is been using. But second of all, let's say that niche is particularly conservative. Interestingly, if that niche is conservative, such as it is the case for Facebook, 7 out of 10 postings in Facebook lean conservative. That's quite an insane number. Even in that case, we see that Facebook still bans Trump, and their model would, and their reason they give us would explain exactly the opposite, right? It would predict something that's totally different, but still in the empirics, it happens. Okay, let's now talk about why is that happening, right? Because the OO mechanism doesn't seem to give us a satisfying answer. The answer is employees. That's the crucial mechanism that's been lacking so far. Why are the employees crucial? All of these social media companies are run by extremely liberal left-wing people that live in the Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, just as a note, is the most blue place in the United States right now, like 80%, 90% Democrats. So there's not a single Republican working at those companies. You see it, like, for example, with their CEOs marching for BLM, marching in pride parades, but you've also see that like there is an extreme danger, even if I as a CEO am not myself liberal, which we also think is likely because you've undergone liberal education and you yourself march at pride parades, but even if you're not liberal, you will risk staff revolts. And we've seen that many times. For example, Facebook having those staff revolts is threatening to quit their jobs if the company is not cracking down further on Trump and not cracking down further on other Republicans. We also seen many other examples in Silicon Valley in general. Note that there's a specific problem regarding moderates because the people are left-wing, but it's also a general problem as those people are unrepresentative and quite elite members. Okay, but even if those companies themselves wouldn't be that liberal, their hiring pool still is, because they hire from Ivy League colleges who are themselves extremely liberal and who care about having that moral and upstanding employer later on. So they still have to cater to that audience. Okay, good. What I think is also extremely important is that even if like a company neglects that, like let's say Facebook is kind of conservative, let's say they neglect that, we've seen in the past that has tremendous economic cost for them. For example, Facebook being sort of neglected and neglecting that crackdown on Republicans led to their labor costs exploding because many people quit their jobs at Facebook, and Facebook is an extremely unpopular employer in the Silicon Valley. So that also addresses a lot of the economic analysis we hear out of OO, saying that you live in a competitive market, you lose your hiring advantage and your labor costs exposed. That's an extremely important problem. But we also say, like their last point, that state backlash, I think that's really symmetric, because you also get state backlash by the Democrats if you don't ban Trump and you don't ban Republicans. So I don't see how they make anything out of here at all. Okay, now let's talk about why in general deplatforming is bad, even if like I've now proved overuse. So but let's not say, even if that's not the case, why still is deplatforming bad? The important word here is unilateral. So not all companies coordinate by let's say some political agent that brings all to the table. Is one company that does that independently. Why is that bad? That will just lead to a lot of alternatives becoming more prominent. Those alternatives will be on social media, as has been like named by OGs, like for example Parler, but also for example like Snapchat. But what we will give you here specifically is the reason why those alternatives are worse and why people migrate to those alternatives. The problem with Parler is that a lot of like their echo chamber stuff that we hear on OO obviously gets worse because you don't have disconfirming evidence at all. But it's also that like Parler is a company that's a lot less cooperative regarding like legislation coming from democratic congresses, and they're also a younger company, so it takes a while to regulate them because you have to read their source code and so on, so legislation takes place. So all of that gets worse, and we think it's harder to regulate these companies. All of the harms that you talk about hate speech get worse in these platforms when you just have people, the echo chamber is just on steroids, right? Okay, before I come to that point, let's take OO.
This harm is 100% symmetrical in the debate because you have incentive and ability to create your own platform where you're pushing this sort of thing, you'll do it this. The difference is at least we're removing one way for them to influence, meaning that it's comparatively better. Your extension doesn't stand.
Now, they like a lot more people going onto Parler after Trump was banned. So obviously you get a lot of that problem, and it gets a lot worse because you have less legal oversight here. And it's just that your whole echo chamber mech is boosted. So it's our extension, of course, stands. Okay, let's now talk about how exactly does that backlash now come to play? Why do people migrate? It's just because people dislike censorship. A lot of moderates have a strong intuition against it because they value things like free speech. They have the intuition of fairness. And if those companies, those neutral platforms of discourse are seen as partisan, that's an extreme problem, and it makes people very pissed. This will lead like to two conclusions, two results. The first one is they migrate to a different platform where they will only have like radical topics, and where they like are more likely also to buy into radical agenda, because like all the radicals can go like, oh, we've always said that Facebook is extremely liberal and tries to censor you, and so they're obviously like more likely to buy that. But second of all, they're just also more likely to then like disengage and like just tune out of normal discourse and also get less of that disconfirming evidence. Lastly, why is that disconfirming evidence and that exposure to other opinions important? Well, you're more likely to demonize others that don't see their takes at all. If Trump doesn't get fact checked behind his Twitter feed, if there's just a lot more people reinforcing your worldview, so all that gets boosted. But I think that mech was already done by our own. We just flip it. So at the end of this debate, those 2 points are crucial. We win on these two, and I'm thus proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. To extend the opposition case, I invite the opposition member.
Awesome. Oh, and POI is in the chat, please. Thanks. The thesis of our case from closing opposition is that politicians, through their social media use, gain an invisible mob. This mob, unlike in the real world, consists of faceless accounts, bots, and trolls. There are strong positive reasons for social media companies to have the license to remove these politicians at will. On their side, this process slows down and gets substantially worse as it both filters through electoral incentives of politicians. We're going to answer the question that has been implicitly bubbling through this round. When does deplatforming happen? Because all we hear is it might be high, it might be low, without explaining crucially what incentives or what explanations companies use to deplatform specific individuals. The first thing I want to note is that there are strong incentives to be sparing with deplatforming. Your primary advantage as a social media is that lots of people want to be on your platform. You want to have a strong social network where people can express and see each other's materials across large webs of your specific social media use. This is why when you create a court or an institution, you probably are going to care about the incentives and interests of everyone in your spectrum, not just your own. OO says that social media companies are consenting to bipartisanship. I don't think that's precise. I think that social media companies just have preferences for maximizing their user base because that's where a lot of the revenue comes from. Things like selling ad space, things like just having more users in general. If you deplatform en masse as a social media company, I think you're going to experience 1, a chilling effect on posting, 2, a concern that people will leave for competitors like Parler, and 3, a concern about all the violations you hear from all the government teams. And I think in turn, you're probably going to be quite sparing for precisely the reasons that we heard from government side. They have to explain to you why the profit incentive is not accurate in these cases, and I don't think they sufficiently have so far. But importantly, you have strong incentives to not just do it sparingly, but to be transparent with your deplatforming and to build institutions around rules governing online speech. Number 1, it's because you often need to justify the removal of politicians in a very public way. That is, this was the demand of OG when they say, we want people to be able to explain why they're removing politicians from social media. On our side, this is because the people that you remove often have large constituencies and platforms before the removal. So to explain to them and to make sure that they don't leave to places like Parler, you have to give explanations. But the second is politicians often fear removal. So still create regulations for clear rules and guidelines for from the social media firms. Things about like how in the United States, the House Tech Committee often cares about these types of things and brings big tech in to discuss the ways in which they engage with these types of things. In exchange, social media often creates impartial and transparent mechanisms for adjudicating disputes to make sure that they can avoid the concerns of fines or any other backlash that might occur, people leaving from the platform, etc. This is why there's a Supreme Court of Facebook that is quite regionally specific and quite balanced about partisan lines, because they care about making sure that people continue to stay on their platform and they care about the potential regulations that come from it. In fact, I think CG agrees with this. When they say things like real world harms are still going to be regulated, we also get to see like those types of things are probably going to happen on our side of the house as well. This is good in and of itself because we get clear rules and guidelines for fair use that are locations for criticism. You can say this is probably a bad way for Facebook to be operating. Importantly, they respond in a way that maybe politicians do not, because the politicians consistently win within their electorates, etc. In our case, Facebook concerns itself with people leaving the platform and does respond to criticism and reforms its policies over time. Important question though, when does deplatforming happen? Because OA mentions that these convenient benefits happen, like removing harmful or false speech, without explaining when they positively happen, and CG suggests the opposite. But both are fact claims that are unweighable on their own. I think the simple reason that deplatforming happens is this. The speech of the politician significantly worsens user experience. This is the direct implication of the claim we have heard throughout this round that companies are profit motivated. They want to continually keep users online, so the only time they restrict speech is if they think it'll harm the user experience and make people not want to use their platform more. I think that the harms to user experience happen within the boundaries of the platform. This is things like politicians instigating, brigading against other users on the behest of that politician, like how Trump just mentioned somebody in a tweet and they are unable to ever really tweet again because hundreds of responses filter into their tweets from his followers, hundreds of hate speech, lots of just like downvotes on Reddit, things like that, or things like inflaming false and hurtful narratives that are constantly applied to any post or any tweet that suggests otherwise. The best example of this is if you ever read a WHO tweet or a Fauci tweet online, you will see most of the top comments are likely from trolls or bots. This stuff is really easy for politicians to instigate because number one, they have a lot of followers that have to commit to the low cost harm of brigading a post with their own posts. Number two, because bots are cheap and constantly follow politicians' cues. Like in general, the central overlapping node of most troll accounts is a politician in question, like Trump or something like that. Three, because they're emboldened by that politician and they're the ones that upvote each other's posts. So those are the ones that get the most visibility. In general, this makes people who dissent against that politician very unable to speak because they're constantly surrounded, quote tweeted, responded to by a lot of hateful and negative or troll content. This is problematic in a number of respects. Number one, dissenting speech often quiets down or hides itself. Think about the times that people use asterisks in their tweets or avoid using certain keywords to avoid trolls. It makes it hard for normal people to express themselves en masse about key issues that are politically salient. It's hard to find these things because they're hidden behind asterisks. Things like ongoing protests, ongoing current events, because of trolls and brigadiers that are often emboldened by that politician. It makes it hard for people to organize or to find one another. It makes it like less likely that people are willing to use social media to gain the benefits of interacting with the larger community instead of just posting to their private group or their private friends. This makes a lot of problems in society and for people on the platform. Before I do that, I'll take OG. Hello?
If you really want to just use rare and selective use of the platforming, your benefit of reducing uncomfortability of user experience would be really marginal because there are a lot of controversial politicians that use and reduce comfortability of user experience. So either you want to have marginal benefit of just selective use.
All I would suggest is that there are only a few cases in which user experience is meaningfully harmed, and it's often by large accounts with large bot and troll followings. Importantly, it makes people in civil society substantially worse. It makes user experience worse. You can't contest elections easily. You can't contest false claims because there's so many cheap ways of brigading these posts. On their side, governments can exploit the vagueness of social media terms to pressure companies into making random banning decisions that may be favorable to the government. The state has interests in deplatforming their opponents in a lot of cases. The state has interests in instigating violence, like in Myanmar, the military often instigates violence, and that's why they were removed from Facebook. The state has interests in controlling narratives in general. There are electoral incentives to remove your opponents, and there's never local support to deplatform incumbents because they were the ones that won the election in the first place, which means that the only types of people that are likely to be deplatformed on their side of the house are people that consistently lose elections, the dissenters that make politics substantially better. This is probably the biggest democratic harm if we want to take OG's metric on this debate, which is it just makes it harder for speech to happen. And in general, I think ruins people's lives. It makes it very hard for dissent or good social media use to happen. And for those reasons, we're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. To conclude for the government bench, I invite the Gov Whip. Here.
Okay, 1 second while I sort my notes, please. Okay, great. Let us start in 3, 2, 1, let's go. At the start of the speech, a little bit of framing, just to be very clear what we're talking about in the debate. So the motion says that we ban companies from independently deplatforming politicians. That does mean politicians can still be deplatformed as long as they are against federal laws and against like official hate speech laws, official like insult laws. In all of those cases where there is an unambiguous case of hate speech, companies can still ban it. Note, this is not a process that is like slower than what opposition has, because obviously Facebook knows about US laws, so they have internal processes of complying with US laws and banning users as quickly as they would be. This doesn't have to go through courts. It just means Facebook doesn't get to make the decision unilaterally, but they need to be able to back up that decision in court and defend their decision under US law. This is what we're talking about. So what this means for the debate is that the kind of statements that opposition gets to ban, that we do not get to ban, are statements that are very ambiguous to the point that they would likely not read as being clearly bad by moderates or moderate conservatives, and as a result are the kinds of things that then drive perceptions of censorship, that drive people off the platform because they feel alienated by what liberally dominated social media platforms are doing. Let's first engage with CO and then OO. What we get from CO is first a repetition of OO's case that companies use this rarely because they're somehow rational. I will engage with this in a second. Secondly, what they tell us is that companies want this to be transparent. Therefore, Facebook instigated a Supreme Court. Even to the extent that they want to, I have no idea that anyone listens to that Supreme Court. Like, I listened to a 2-hour podcast explaining how this thing works. I don't think the average Facebook user wants that or cares about why some Argentinian like former constitutional court lawyer sits on that court and what decisions they make. The rulings are not read by people. So this transparency doesn't benefit any public perception of what Facebook is doing and doesn't have strong impact in the debate. Okay, cool. Secondly, what they tell us is that so that companies do this in the cases in which speech makes the life bad for users, like trolling or brigading. This is really confusing to me on 2 grounds. A, trolling and brigading are things that exist in the status quo and are very much often not banned. So this is not something that companies do right now anyway. Secondly, your whole causal mechanism was saying companies care about profit, therefore they do things that benefit profit. But creating anger and outrage is like the best profit in like causal mechanism to create more profit and attention for social media companies. Generally, they love trolling because it creates controversy, it creates attentions, users are more engaged in either doing the trolling or fighting the trolling. You can't explain your own case like that. Lastly, what they tell us is that this would be bad in Myanmar because the state forces Facebook to deplatform opponents. Like, just note that in cases in which the government is capable of crafting laws in such a way to fuck their opposition, Facebook is the least of your problems and they can force Facebook to do stuff in a myriad of other ways. I don't think this matters hugely in the debate. Now, let's engage with opening opposition. Quickly on the principle, which I don't think matters hugely in the debate, they tell us that companies have some kind of like principled right to refuse service or have some kind of like negative freedom not to do stuff. I think there's many examples in the real world of where we restrict companies in a variety of ways that are all pretty common sense. Like the state maybe doesn't force you to drive to a certain place with your car, but the state can force you to only drive with your seatbelt on and to not drive with your seatbelt off, which is also a kind of like negative constraint. But we also know that there's like many normal Supreme Court rulings where bakeries that are like the only supplier of something in town are forced to cater to all customers because otherwise they would be excluded. I think ultimately, like, there are many reasons that states already use to restrict company freedoms. As long as they can prove an appreciable harm that happens, to the extent that we can, I don't think this principle is particularly unique or relevant in the debate. Now, important clashes in the debate. First question is, do companies use this tool appropriately? And what we've given you specifically are reasons for why companies are unlikely to behave as rational profit maximizers because they have other incentives. Note that both of the opposition teams only rely on saying companies are rational entities that want to maximize profits, therefore they behave in a certain way. Note that just note that many companies don't behave rationally all the time. Chick-fil-A has like a pretty anti-gay founder and therefore causes a lot of boycotts of their own brand, and they lose a lot of money that way. This is not rational behavior, but they still do it because the people that constitute a company ultimately make the decisions, and they don't have to be rational. The second thing that Dominic gave you that was completely unresponded to by closing opposition is that Silicon Valley companies are made of predominantly very liberal people, because both like Ivy League colleges in the US are strongly liberal and strongly democratic, and because the companies themselves recruit people that tend to be very liberal. This means if you want the top tier talent that these companies rely on winning like the technological arms races in Silicon Valley, you need to recruit those people, and they also make up the vast majority of their company. As a result, the decisions you make are likely going to be predominantly liberal. Okay, before I explain what that means,
right-wing and left-wing ads pay the same money. So they do not have an incentive to create niches, but have an incentive to expand their user base, which flips your mechanism. But also Twitter does not want to look as the only company banning Trump. This is why they're likely to do it when collectively they agree that he is the worst, because otherwise can Trump simply go to Facebook? This also flips your case.
Okay, look, we can see that there's many cases where companies didn't act in coordinated ways. When Milo Yiannopoulos was banned, that didn't happen across all platforms. Like with many right-wing personalities, we didn't see that trend. That just doesn't happen in reality. What we've given you are structural reasons for why companies don't behave rationally in these cases and are likely to overuse this in bad ways. What does this now mean in terms of impacts? This means that the decisions that these companies make are seen as being unfair and censorious by the average user. As a result, your conservative users are very willing to migrate to other platforms. Also note that many of the typical network effects don't matter that much for social media companies. Like we can see that people are pretty okay with randomly going to Instagram or TikTok. So to the extent that people switch social media platforms pretty consistently, we see that they're likely to do it here anyway. Why does this matter for the debate? This matters because the most conservative and radical people, they go to Parler. They still get the same kind of hate speech. And these are the people that would then commit acts of violence or treason in the real world. So you get the most committed people on a more radical platform doing the same thing. But to the extent that Trump says bad things on Parler, this is still something that CNN is going to cover, that is still going to be talked about on Twitter. So the same kind of hate speech effects in terms of just negative experiences still apply. At the end of the day, on our side, we get to still regulate all of the clearly illegal things. On your side, you get the same kind of reach of bad messages, but you can't even restrict the clearly illegal speech acts on Parler because they are hosted on Russian servers. We make life a bit better for everyone, so please propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. And to conclude for their side of the House and the round as a whole, I invite the opposition whip.
Okay, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
I've had some issues with my mic today, so please stop me if you can't hear me at some point. I want to start the speech by noting quickly that this motion is this House would ban companies from doing it, which means that if you think that there is a legitimate use case in which these politicians are actively causing harm towards people and that companies have a principled right or even a principled obligation to actually deplatform those individuals, then we win this debate. So what was our extension? I think there are three main components to highlight. First is that we explain when deplatform actually happens, because CG is partially correct. The OO's primary use cases would already be covered by existing speech laws, such as anti-violence or anti-hate speech laws, which means that their use cases are marginal at best, whereas our use cases actually speak to the majority of user experiences, i.e. being trolled or being brigaded by people. And that's the type of thing that social medias are concerned about. More on that in a second. The second part of our extension is about institutional creation. And this is just laughed at by CG, but they don't actually engage with any of the real arguments here. The threat of antitrust has instigated Google and Facebook to be upfront about their terms of service, upfront about their privacy rules, upfront about the ways in which they can deplatform people, and crucially, upfront about the rules that govern all speech on the platform. This is why this argument has such a big impact, is because only once in every few months are you actually going to deplatform a politician. But every second of every day, there are speech violations that occur on Facebook or on Google or on Twitter that need to be adjudicated in some way. When people feel like things are being done unfairly, I think as CG points out, when they get mad at that platform, that causes a huge amount of disutility towards them. When rules are transparent and when they're able to perceive that things are actually fair and accurate in some way in advance, that massively improves not just politicians or people who adhere to politicians' user experiences, but everyone's. That's why that argument matters, and the scope of the argument is actually extremely big. The third thing that we told you is about democratic speech and the democratic principle. And I think this clashes directly with open government's principle, which I'm going to dispense with in a second. There are two components to what we told you about democratic speech in this round. One is that in states that have weak institutions like Myanmar, but also states like Egypt, for example, where this has been definitely occurring, which is that you can use a lack of clarity in the rules of social media companies for states to intervene proactively and suppress dissent. This is why in Russia, for example, Navalny and his supporters literally cannot use Twitter or literally cannot use other types of social media platforms. And this is why Twitter is trying to be more upfront about the fact that they need to create these rules to insulate these people and not allow politicians who are in the incumbent majority to suppress dissent. Second of all, it also harms democratic speech insofar as this contaminates a lot of information by spreading misinformation. We care, I tell you, about democratic speech insofar as it is information enhancing for the electorate, and they can make more responsible and accurate decisions about what types of politicians and decisions they actually want to support. Insofar as a lot of the information propagating that happens, that gets banned on our side of the house, actively deteriorates the quality of the democratic discourse. Number one, I don't think OG's principle is here because they don't tell you the instrumental reasons why we care about speech. They just say speech is good, but some speech is clearly bad insofar as it harms others. But two, it also explains where we get better political outcomes. The second thing I want to say is on OG, and this just takes them out of debate, is that this is a private forum, and any private forum has rules that regulate what type of speech you can say. So they can't just carte blanche say all speech is good, especially when you opt in by signing the terms of service at the beginning, and when there are alternatives for you so you can switch over to other platforms, as all of the teams in the debate agree. Insofar as there's no principle left for OG, but also we do additional work on top of what OO tells you with their sort of watery principle. I'm going to tell you why this actively harms democratic speech. I think we are actually coming out on top in the sense that social media platforms have a principal obligation to at least enforce in some instances that this should be a code. So, what does CG say, and why is it wrong? So they talk about how deplatforming happens because of the political ideologies of individuals within these companies. First of all, I just want to do some weighing, which is that the profit incentive that regulates and causes these people to be sparing about using the ban button is much bigger than their personal ideologies. Why is that the case? Because the profit incentive dictates whether or not the company exists or literally is accountable to the shareholders in a particular year. They will get deposed of their positions. Like Mark Zuckerberg will lose his job as CEO of Facebook if they don't make a profit, which means that clearly that is the dispositive thing that they're looking at, not just their personal views. Also, the people at the top who actually make decisions, people like Mark Zuckerberg, are largely anti-ideological. I don't care about what the software engineers believe, that they're individual Democrats. People like Mark Zuckerberg are only Democrats instrumentally insofar as that may support their particular agenda. They also donate heavily to Republicans. People who run these companies are often conservative. The second thing they talk about is how, oh, companies are liberal, so they ban conservatives, and that's really bad. This argument doesn't have an impact. They don't actually tell you what the impact is, because conservative speech is worse. It is anti-vaccine. It is pro-violence. It's pro-conspiracy in many instances. They don't even wade into the reasons why we should care, even if it is. But second of all, I don't think it is disproportionate against conservatives for a couple of reasons. For all the things that we've told you already, which is that there's a huge fear of retaliation against these companies. They don't want to have the ban hammer against them and breaking up Google, which is actually a viable threat in the status quo. And there's also obviously huge legal stakes to this. they could get sued severely by these companies or by these politicians as well as their adherents if they overstep their bounds. That's why these companies are very reticent about this, and they don't want to risk things too much and don't want to cause a disparate impact. But also, if they're not following the rules, it doesn't matter what the political ideology of the people who are violating the rules are. They get banned anyways. That's what transparency means. When I talk about alternatives, this is very similar to an argument that we hear from OG, so I'll be responding to OG when I respond to CG here as well. 3 responses here. One is that by banning these individuals, you nuke the organizational capacity of the group. That is to say, the ability to actually gather, because there's a transaction cost of switching platforms, which means that it makes it harder to physically organize events. But second of all, followers take cues from leaders. If leaders are less visible and there are less cues being followed, that is why after the riot and the insurrection at the Capitol, when Trump was banned, those people were not able to gather in mass again because they just took fewer cues from their leaders. Before I move on, I will take
오케이. 야, 그렇게 맞으라고 하는 거 아니야.
Because the platform politicians doesn't violate many followers in Twitter, but massively creating a huge consumer transition towards right-wing media like Parler is exclusive harm in OG, and the polarized and victimized people get radical.
Great. So one is that the reason why Parler was less popular to begin with is that it's a worse platform, which means that literally these people don't have as much of a public ability with as many social network effects to be able to broadcast their views. But also most harms don't appear there anyways, because a lot of the violent speech is still going to be illegal, and those people face incentives just like all the other ones that we've talked about. This Parler buzzword doesn't really make sense. What does CG say in response to our extension? They say no one listens to the court. You know who listens to the Supreme Court? Facebook? Facebook. And politicians who have to engage and go through Facebook who would otherwise think that these decisions are unfair. They just laugh at this argument, that this argument is actually winning. But also, when they say that trolling is liked by these companies, that's ridiculous because it drives users off the platform insofar as it actually makes people hate their experience on Twitter. So that is the biggest thing that Twitter is afraid of, is people leaving Twitter, not just being a little bit annoyed. This is what happens when you get brigaded, and this is what happens when you feel like you're not safe on the platform. They therefore mishandle our argument about brigading, and insofar as that's true, that is the vast majority of when these companies would be interested in banning this type of behavior. That also takes us above OO because our use cases are more prevalent, and they're actually more relevant for how people want to engage with the platforms, and therefore are more relevant for the incentives facing these companies. Very proud to be on.
Cool. Thank the speaker for that speech. I thank all the speakers for the round. As before, please do leave this breakout room so we can have our discussion. And I will see you in 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, everyone.